I'd like to take the opportunity to call this meeting to order. And if you'll do the roll call.
Here.
Eric Moran,
Here.
Kyle Niederman,
Here.
Lisa Roman,
Here.
John Madison,
Here. And let's take a moment for silent prayer reflection. Amen. You'll stand and join me in the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. That brings us down to review and accept the agenda for the session.
I move to accept the agenda.
Second.
Kyle Niederman,
Yes.
Lisa Roman,
Yes.
Eric Moran,
Yes.
Marciana Alliar,
Yes.
John Madison,
Yes. And that brings us to information items. Mr. Murray, that's you.
We have some information for you tonight. Ms. Tosca Henry, District's legal counsel, is also in attendance this evening. Today we are going to meet together to begin the process of hopefully developing a very well-defined facilities use manual and process to allow those who wish to use our facilities the opportunity to do so. So with the help of Ms. Henry and with the board, obviously, in this work session, we'd like to begin that process. Over many years, it's been tough. This facilities use process was housed in the Educational Services Department for many years, and I would watch that individual and assist where I could go through this process with people who were actually petitioning to use our facilities. And the difficult part was that many people, many organizations over the many, many years, way before any of us were here, had a history with the district in stating that they were granted use of the facilities at no charge. And so it became very difficult for the individual who is processing the request to then find out whether or not the organization was truthful. A lot of times there was partial truth to what they were requesting. So we're here tonight just to begin the process and try to make it as pure as possible so that from this point going forward, or whenever we finally put our finishing touches on this manual going forward, that there's no longer a process of one individual picking what I always say is picking winners and losers. I think it needs to be very clear, a process for all who may think that they should receive an uncompensated use of the facility. That just comes with transparency and a process to make that happen. So tonight, I did send, Terry sent the facilities use manual to the board several days ago. So if you have not reviewed the manual, if you could review it in the days to come, that would be great. I think the manual, for the most part, is pretty comprehensive. I think there's very little changes, maybe a phone number here or little things here and there that would need to be changed or updated. But I think the majority of the conversation lies with the process of who pays and who does not. And how do we determine through that process how they're selected. And by statute it's very clear, and I'll let Ms. Henry talk about the legalities of things. Maybe I'll have her do that, and then we can start the conversation. And if you have the manual in front of you, the uncompensated use section is on page 4 of 16. It's a very short, one paragraph section, but that will be a big part of why we're here tonight.
Thank you. Governing Board President, board members, superintendent, staff, and members of the public, is this on, or am I? You want to press the white button? Do I have to keep it pressed, or there we go. Thank you. Good evening again, Tosca Henry, District Council. I'd like to start with some of the legal concerns that I'd ask the board to consider as you're moving forward with trying to address some of the ambiguities and concerns that were just raised by Mr. Murray. We frequently talk about the Arizona constitutional prohibition on gifts of public funds. So that's an important consideration as we're navigating through this particular question of how do we identify groups that should be able to use district property without paying a rental fee or usage fee. So we work backwards from Arizona Constitution prohibits gifts of public funds. We have a specific statute on point, which is in Title 15, which is the set of statutes that relate directly to education, and it gives us the framework for the lease of school property. We have certain portions of the statute actually incorporated into the manual, and I'd like to go over briefly with the board that this particular statute allows the governing board or your superintendent or chief administrative officer. In the past, we've designated this to Mr. Murray's office with your express approval. So that approval has to be express and on the record. I recommend that it be done on an annual basis when the facility use manual and the fees are approved by the board, which is supposed to occur annually. So at that same time, it's good to also refresh the authority and designation, the delegation to the appropriate person at the district. So noting that there are gift of public funds questions always raised for a public entity in this analysis, the governing board is authorized to lease school property, including your buildings, grounds, buses, equipment, etc. Pretty broad classification of district property to any person, group, organization for any lawful purpose. That includes recreational, educational, political, economic, artistic, moral, scientific, social, religious. I think you get the idea. Very broad category of purposes. The governing board, superintendent, or the chief administrative officer shall, so this is mandatory language in statute, shall charge a reasonable use fee for the lease of the school property. Importantly, that reasonable fee may include in kind. It may include goods contributed or services rendered by that person, group, or organization to the school district. So it does not necessarily have to be financial. Now, we're here tonight mostly focusing on the request for uncompensated use. So we just heard that mandatory language, but there's an exception to that. So again, the governing board or your designee may permit the uncompensated use of buildings, grounds, buses, equipment, that same exact broad categories of district equipment, same broad purposes, with the approval of the governing board. However, the analysis is that the group has to be school-related, including student political organizations, or by any organization whose membership is open to the public and whose activities promote the educational function of the school district as determined in good faith by the district's governing board. So that's a case-by-case decision to be made by each school district. There is some additional language in the statute as far as the educational function that is incorporated in the facility use manual, so we'll see that in a minute when we turn to that, so hold that thought. But the slide that we have up front for the board is a portion of the facility use manual. There are also several school district policies that deal with the use, compensated or otherwise, of school facilities. So part of this process has to be a big picture. I know that your superintendent is working to update in a systematic manner all of the district policies. So when we're asking questions tonight, I think it's a good place to work backwards from the actual manual and then plug in the direction that we receive from the board into the policy discussion. When I review the community use of school facilities and the different policies, there are multiple policies and or regulations that are directly on point. We see the same concerns. They're vague, they're ambiguous. They say a school-related group has priority, and then they list large buckets of what are considered to be school-related groups, and that doesn't solve the problem that we heard from Mr. Murray earlier. How is staff then supposed to say, well, you truly are a school-related group versus you are not? So let's tuck that away. Just I want to make sure you know we do have several policies that will need to be looked at as part of this process, but let's turn to where Mr. Murray left off, and that is with the facility use manual itself. This document needs to be user-friendly, not just for the board and administration, but this is a document that third-party groups are referred to as far as this is the framework, here's the application, here's the game plan, the playing rules for any group that would like to use school district property. We start with page 4 for purposes of the uncompensated use, and this language is very similar to the language that we just saw in the statute. I am not going to reread all of it because we've gone over that, except reading from the educational function. This is taken directly from statute, and that means uses that are directly related to the educational mission of the district. That means this can change periodically, and that's part of why I believe the legislature requested, or actually didn't request, gave direction that you're to look at this on an annual basis because your educational mission can change. As adopted by the governing board, includes the educational mission-related uses of parent-teacher organizations, youth organizations, and school employee organizations. Use of facilities or property by organizations indicated above that will require a substantial district cost for utilities, services, supplies, and/or personnel may be permitted only if goods contributed, services rendered, or payments are made to reimburse these costs to the district. There we had another question, another topic, and request for direction from the board as far as what does this board consider to be a substantial use? How is that determined? Mr. Murray has some examples of uses and some of the costs that are associated with those. I don't know if now is a good time to discuss briefly those, or if you'd like to wait until later. It doesn't matter. Probably. Okay. So one of the questions there again, here with the uncompensated use, I would suggest revisions to this language, which we'll bring back to the board after we have a discussion of a later page, if we're ready to move to page 12. Did anybody have a question so far or comment at this early stage? Okay, then if we can turn to page 12 of 16. This is where I personally would like to devote the most time with the board tonight, tempered with Mr. Murray's topics for the board as well, because here we have the current class definitions, and I'd like to highlight some of the, I apologize, it's page 12 of 16. If we can just scroll down one more paragraph, please. Thank you. So these are the current class definitions, and I think these definitions highlight some of the questions that staff might have as far as how do we determine who actually fits in Class 1 and Class 2. It's also my understanding that we have some groups in Class 2 that have been provided free use of school district property for years, and perhaps should continue to do so if that is the board's direction as far as what their role and function, if they meet the criteria of the statute there. And then Class 3, again, is the commercial profit-making. That one, I think the district has down pretty well with the application process. So first discussion point or question from my standpoint is review of these specific categories and perhaps contemplating a different procedure that helps staff every year. And one of the procedures that was discussed was an application procedure where groups could have an application every year, submitted every year with maybe some leeway for folks that missed the deadline or just didn't learn about it, it wasn't on their radar. And that way the board could consider what groups are actually requesting to use the facilities and do they meet the criteria. So the application would need to have items such as that are listed in the statute. Are you open to the public? Tell us, organization, how you believe you meet our educational mission and function and some other specific questions to help the board and then help staff be able to say this was what was already approved. Also, when I look at the current categories listed under Class 1, for example, I don't know how many groups. In fact, I was asking or discussing with Mr. Murray, do you still have Boy and Girl Scouting groups that are reaching out to use district space right now? And any of the other items on the list. I think the governing board approved intergovernmental agreements are one that we should be able to list with specificity because we should know which ones are approved and are using space, and we could, instead of having a broad category there, include them with specificity. And then are there groups that are listed right now in Class 2 that really should be in Class 1 because of the, just the specific nature of the organization and the function that's being carried out? So not to muddy the waters too much, but it is really, I guess, the second question, apart from the what types of groups do we want in each class, but also do we want to implement a different procedure? Mr. Murray voiced a concern. He doesn't want to just add unnecessary work for the board and for staff, but trying to streamline, again, the process and not make staff the arbiter of you are in Class 1, you're in Class 2, without significant guidance and direction from the board. The last, go ahead, please.
Would the benefit of an annual application be mostly to give each organization kind of a heads up? For instance, we have a group, a local symphony that would like to use our auditorium. If they were to apply well in advance of their intended use of the facility, that might give them an idea. Well, you've been designated Class 2 or you've been designated Class 1. That way they know when they, well in advance of when they book the facility, what their costs will be. Is that what the intended benefit for the application is?
It's one of the pros. There are multiple, though. So, but one is to provide greater clarity and guidance. And also, Mr. Murray raised an issue of, well, how frequently are the groups, for planning purposes for staff? Do we have a group that has one event per school year or per whatever, per fall, and then one in the spring? Is this going to be an ongoing usage 2 or 3 times for football season or whatever the case may be? So it also serves to help with planning purposes as far as the calendaring of the usage. But it isn't, one of the cons is there may be a very valid group that may be left out of the procedure. So then how do we then address that? What is that procedure to make sure that there are groups that can still request the uncompensated use and still be approved. But yes, that is a very big pro as well, just overall planning purposes. Mr. Murray, did you want to add to that as well?
So that process would definitely help us. It would help the organization as far as from planning perspective. The direction Ms. Henry was talking about for us in the business department would be nice to know if there is a cap as to how many times they can use the facilities, because you may have a group that is just so grateful to use it one time, and then you might have those who want to use it every other weekend. So these are just things that, as we move forward, again, not being able to solve everything tonight, but at least moving in that direction, these are just things that will come across our desk and do come across our desk, and we'd like to be able to have very clear guidance from the board as to we're grateful that you want to use our facilities, and here's what that looks like. Not to say we can't differentiate, but if we're going to differentiate, then we need to be prepared to back that up with, this group received 8 days and you're only receiving 4 days, and to avoid any type of discrimination or anything that may resemble that, we need to be able to back that up as to why we gave this group 8 days. We treated this group a little bit differently than this group, if that was to happen.
If we were to adopt an application process, do you envision any sort of appeal? For instance, some group gets designated as a Class 3 and they don't think that that's fair. Do you envision them being able to appeal to the board as a whole?
The board could give direction that they wanted to include an appeal process. One of my goals would be just to streamline board time and analysis as well as staff time and analysis. And we're really just, again, that's why we're having this discussion tonight. So if you were to look at other districts and see what do other districts do, there are some that are very similar to ours because earlier when I was reading the language directly from statute, the statute references some of the groups that are included in our Class 1. So we see some of that language throughout other facility use manuals. However, many facility use manuals that I've reviewed have increased guidance both to staff and to third parties. For example, one that I was reviewing via email with Mr. Murray includes the broader language of the groups, but then gives more specific examples and also calls out a specific organization, which is, I'll leave out the specific city, but it's a Boys and Girls Club because there's a long-term lease that has already ironed out what the legal, the legal framework that we're talking about now. But they also exempt out some volunteer groups that are conducting specific activities for their particular district students. And then they give additional YMCAs in there, Little League, Pop Warner, and then there's some very specific community youth sports organizations that they build in a percentage of their students. So if you have 75% of this district students participating in your organization, then we specifically include you as a community youth sports organization that can use our facilities. So there again, although it's not perfect guidance, there is still always going to be some interpretation left to staff. There is a lot more guidance and ability, because I don't know here at Havasu with this language if we could say community youth sports organization, if you have 75% of our students, will that fall under one of our classes above? I don't know that it would. I think that would be a hard argument to say. Is that a school-sponsored activity? Not from the information we have right there. It's not a school club, and on down the line. I also want to make sure that the board knows, regardless of the fee, or whether a fee is charged or the organization falls under the uncompensated use, the insurance requirement is not waived. So that is set in statute and may not be waived. They do have to show that proof of insurance and provide that to the district as part of the application process.
Ms. Henry, can I just add to maybe clarify a little bit for Ms. Ramon? Class 2 and Class 3 are pretty, they're the easiest of all, because Class 2 refers to you're a nonprofit. So usually if they have nonprofit status, they supply us with the proper documentation showing that, and they're totally in agreement with Class 2. Class 3 is commercial profit making. They're running a tournament from out of state. They're passing through town. We had that before, where a group from Vegas and a group from Phoenix, they just wanted to meet in the middle, and they had no problem paying the Class 3 rate because they were a commercial profit making group. The issue seems to always be from determining whether they're class 2 or class 3, but they think they're class 1 because they want the facility for free, or they think they're supporting the educational function of the district. So class 1 is really the area that we need to iron out, because class 2 and class 3 are pretty, most people understand that and they're accepting of it. It's only the ones who want to push it to class 1 status and not have to pay at all. And then that's the process that we need to determine here as a board and as a district.
And so I think I jumbled some of my requests for direction into one kind of bucket when there are really three. And the first is, who does the board see appropriate to fit into the class 1, the uncompensated use? And the second question or request for direction is, what is the procedure that the board would like to implement? Is it implement some kind of an annual application, knowing that we're going to have some kind of an other process if a group misses that? Or would the board prefer instead to discuss specific groups, perhaps have Mr. Murray provide historical information about groups that have historically used the facilities or made these requests, and then have a specific discussion on whether or not this meets the educational function, of for this particular time period. So that is another way, but again, just having some better definition as far as the procedure and then the classes. The third piece is the procedure for determining the goods and services. I think that is very rarely triggered. In fact, I was sharing with Mr. Murray, I've only been informed of one district that actually told me about it. Of course, I'm not told all the day-to-day dealings of different districts. But they were asking, did I think a particular in-kind pass muster for purposes of the gift clause and the statute we just read. So, Mr. Murray, I guess back to you is, do you see frequent requests for in-kind goods or services for usage?
The only time that I was made aware of that happening was many years ago. District additional assistance money was very much of a small of amount, and there were some improvements that needed to be made at the PAC. And we did have community groups who utilize the PAC right now actually donate a considerable amount of money and perform some upgrades to, I believe it was lighting and sound in the Performing Arts Center. So that's what started the whole conversation of, well, you can now use the facility, and that just hasn't changed since then, at no charge.
Okay.
So that was the only example that I know of where a group provided a substantial amount in upgrades, and the result was they are using the facility at no charge.
And part of the reason, or the whole reason I raised that is, even though it's rarely triggered in my experience, but our statute does require that that analysis occur on the part of the board. Is, what will the procedure be to determine the goods and services? I think there's language that can suffice as far as delegating that analysis, perhaps estimating what the cost to the district and trying to match what the value of the in-kind services, and a sentence or two along those lines would be sufficient if the board wished to move in that direction. But just know that that is analysis that is required by the statute as part of this. So with those three main requests for direction from the board, what I would like to know is if the board would like to have discussion tonight, or if you have requests for additional information from myself or from Mr. Murray, if you'd like to see other examples or discuss other examples of policies or any discussion items that you might have tonight.
I know what would help for me is to have some case studies, with what kind of the problem issues that have come up, and
we can do it blind if we want to. You know, this type of community group is asking, has done this in the past, this is the problems it's caused. Seeing that would really help. Maybe having some examples of policy that could help on different fronts, that we could kind of read through those case studies and decide which language would best help the district to do that. That's something that I think would help me kind of process all this and make some decisions.
Yeah, some more specifics about some of the different groups too that have applied that want from class 3 or class 2 and want to move to class 1, I think would be good as well.
I have a quick question. Do we think that we should just have this be a board agenda item every time we have somebody apply? Would that help us just to go ahead and have it come before the board every time somebody applies to use a facility?
I would like to avoid that.
Well, how many different groups are requesting that? How many different groups are using our facilities right now?
So I
yearly?
can tell you that we don't really have case studies, but I can get names of organizations or individuals. But we primarily see our community groups like Symphonic Winds, the choir, all those who are kind of umbrellaed with them. There's probably 6 or 7 groups. Like Havasu Ballet appears to be umbrellaed with them. So again, it goes back to is the requestor, is their organization or group supporting the educational function of the district? If the answer is yes, then that aligns with statute, but that would be a determining factor from the board. We also have Mr. Zampona is here with us tonight too from the athletic side of things. We also have district employees who usually are coaches for the district, but then they also oversee tournament type ball, off-season groups that they're on the volleyball team with the district during the regular season, but then they also compete and practice as a volleyball team away from the district, not as the Knights, but as a separate group, and continue on with practicing throughout the school year. And that happens in quite a few sports. So we're talking volleyball and softball, and there's quite a few sports. And then they, of course, would like to use the facilities at no charge as well. So those are pretty much the big ones that are requesting. The Symphonic Winds big group there of 6 or 7, and then sports. We do have some local individuals who are not part of the district, but who also run a soccer camp or soccer league outside of the school district, wrestling camps or a wrestling program, 6 months out of the year. They also request to use facilities as well.
I think perhaps it might be too expensive and time consuming to determine the cost how much it costs the district for each different group and each activity. But what if we could come up with something like the use of the auditorium, like, a sort of a rough cost, that this is our cost basis for that, and the use of the sports fields, how many people are deployed, or I don't know, the cost of electricity or whatever it is, and have a broad base of what it's going to cost us. Is that something we want to do, or?
So the dollar amounts on page 13 and 14. They're the hourly rates to use the facilities. And those they haven't been changed in a little while, but we have part of our building at the high school campus on solar now. But those hourly rates are pretty comparable to what it would be to run electricity for that particular part of the building or facility on an hourly basis.
none of those fees include the staff resources in order to run those facilities?
It does not. So
Okay.
if their use of that particular part of the facility requires a custodian or an auditorium director to run the microphones and the mixers, then that's an additional cost.
So can we create like just a base, one number for each, and then go on that? Because this looks like too much work for you, for your office, as well as for the board to be determining this every time. It might be inefficient.
Well, the hourly rates for class 2 and 3 are established. Obviously, those will come to you formally once we get this whole document together, and then you'll see this every year. The real question is just class 1, who will qualify, because it is in statute. It is an allowable, it is something that is allowable where people could have, an organization could have an uncompensated use of our facilities. It's just how do we manage that, and who qualifies for that. So, and then we would obviously eat the cost of the electrical, or the cost to allow somebody to be in this room for 2 hours because they support the educational function of the district. You know, sometimes $50, you know, for the hour or 2 hours to be in this room is worth the expense if we have a very meaningful group in here with a bunch of kids who are benefiting because whatever it is that they're doing in here supporting the educational function of the district. That $50 cost that we would absorb, we couldn't spend $50 to allow a great experience for 10, 15, 20, 30 kids. So I think the question is just who qualifies for class 1, because again, it is in statute, it is allowable. I think we just have to be careful because, I mean, I think that we could allow everybody to be class 1 if we don't really pay attention to the educational function of the district from that particular group or organization, how they're supporting the district.
Yeah.
But I will do whatever you want of me. I will just give me a little bit of time, and we're in auditing season. Auditors are here starting tomorrow again, so I won't have it for you tomorrow, but whatever you need, I'll get.
No, I just think that, I mean, it's sounding like there's a lot of work for your office and for the board with all the different groups, so whatever way you want to handle that.
In all reality, if this would make it a lot easier for my department to know who actually qualifies for class 1.
That's all.
Because we have not been doing that forever, and it's just been so difficult, and it's just draining on people because you're trying to help people and you're trying to do what's right, but when you have no roadmap and really nothing to guide you in making that informed decision, again, you're picking those who get it and those who don't, and we just don't want to live there anymore. We want to have clear direction from the board and give everyone an opportunity to qualify.
And I think, addressing President Madsen's concern, if we have some good policy that has an appeal process that could eventually come to the board, but, has some really due process, so we just don't have everybody coming in and coming to the board and doing trying to get an exception. I think that is something that I would be really looking to do, having some type of clear policy. So to me, getting some language from you and Tosca about what you think would kind of work, maybe with some options as a starting point, and then seeing how that would play out with our groups that are kind of in the middle, and seeing how that would play out, I think would be a helpful exercise.
I completely agree. And I think knowing the mission and understanding that with the 5 board members as you all do, I think that will also help in determining who qualifies and who does not. I mean, and I'm not picking on ballet, but I'm just saying, does the district offer ballet classes? The answer that I know, I don't think we do. I know we don't. However, is that a disqualifying, just because the district doesn't offer ballet, how can ballet support the educational function? How does ballet support the educational function of the district? Now, the ballet has, the district has band and choir, so if the community choir is presenting themselves and asking for a Class 1 categorization of their group, and they can articulate how the choir supports the educational function of the district because they can articulate and tie K-12 to their group. I think the case for a group like that may be a little bit more easy to determine. Not saying that the ballet wouldn't be, because I can tell you my daughter took ballet for many years, and I can see that there's a lot of value to that as well. Those are just questions, I think, and that would have to be considered by the board in tying that group and organization and the activity that they're providing to the educational function of the district.
I think that would be a helpful exercise for the groups for themselves to do as well. Like you're saying in the case of like a community choir or a ballet, them petitioning forth and saying, hey, ballet is helping your students. All 99 out of 100 of our students are your students, and them doing something like that. That to me is maybe a helpful process for them to go through as well.
And that's, Ms. Henry and I were talking about, as she pointed out early on, that I believe should be a very key part of the application process, and probably one of the most given spaces on the application where you have the most room to articulate and plead your case before the board as to this is what we do and this is how we support the educational function of the district. But I completely agree.
And one of the items that Mr. Murray and I had discussed, reviewed again, looking at outside districts, some districts utilize a checklist that help the actual organization to determine when they're going through the application, what areas they meet or where they may be lacking, and that could be a useful tool. However, depending on the application, it might just be overkill. It might just be something that staff puts significant time in and doesn't help, because we can incorporate a lot of the items that were on that checklist into the district's actual application fairly efficiently. Doesn't have to make it a 20-page application.
Going back to your earlier point, Dr. Arand, I definitely see the point that you're making, that activities such as ballet or the symphony do support, at least in the sense of they're providing cultural opportunities for our students. So you can definitely make a valid case that they're supporting the education that our district is offering. My only counterpoint to that would be that I feel like you would open the door for all of the sports clubs in our community to make that same point and say, well, you teach PE in your schools and we're offering a basketball program, so that means that we're also in compliance with that part of the agreement. And so I want to be generous and to recognize the fact that our schools, many of the facilities that we have and many of the improvements that we've been able to make recently are because of community support. So I do want to be generous in that sense, but I also want to be sensitive to the fact that if we open the doors too broadly, it will be a very crowded field.
That's an excellent point. That's where I think case studies will become very, very helpful, because I think, as we were saying, if we have that checklist of things, we can kind of discern what those types of things were being. For example, does district offer it? It can be a real, key thing. Is it providing an opportunity for our kids that they don't already have? Those types of things. So I think looking at those case studies and getting that checklist, I think, while we may not want to have, a 300-thing checklist like the other districts have or something like that, we could craft something that's very workable for Havasu.
And once we do this application process, are we going to make every group that has applied to reapply for a new class? Are we going to establish every single group again in that process, or?
So I believe by statute, it has to be an annual process.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we-
Especially, yep.
Yeah, so we'd probably want to streamline it so it's not too terrible for the.
I just don't want to see 2,000 groups come before us every single year or something
Yeah.
like that. I don't know exactly how many groups apply, so.
Well,
I think that once the word gets out, we'll probably see an increase.
Absolutely.
Right now, we probably have no more than a dozen,
Okay.
but I think once the word gets out, that you will, like I said, we'll probably have more apply.
And I think with a clearer process, they won't necessarily have to come before the board. Maybe some rare exceptions or things like that.
Appeal
Hopefully,
process.
if we do our job well.
So some of the items that I've heard as far as direction, I've heard the case studies, so again, groups with historical use, and then maybe what are some of the community groups that have been requesting to use the facilities but maybe have been denied or vice versa. So again, looking back to see what has been in the past, and then perhaps some samples of some items that might be either on a checklist or incorporated into the application. Some things that are recurring themes, again, are how does this organization fit into the educational function of the district? I've also heard a concern about whether or not it's an item that's taught in district or already offered here, and is that good, is that bad? That's another topic for the board. We did discuss, again, is this something that our district students or staff are involved in? So perhaps if it is a community sports group that has a very large percentage of Havasu students participating, should they get treated as a class 1 or not? So I'll work with Mr. Murray to come up with some topics or items for you to actually look at as far as either in a checklist format, bullet point format, or even in incorporating into the application. I think a checklist would be easier for a discussion purpose, easier to create, easier to work with, if that is all right with the board. So, were there any items that I just missed as far as items that you'd like to see come back for the next discussion on this topic?
The only thing that jumps out to me in the class definitions, I would prefer it if specific groups were not mentioned by name. So for instance, it does specifically designate Boys and Girl Scouts in class 1. And so I would rather have the language be more general and broadly applicable.
Okay. Any other direction from the board at this time? And I didn't know, Mr. Murray, you did say that we had Mr. Zampagna here. I don't know if there was any other discussion or items to add from any other staff.
I'll leave it to Dustin. I don't.
I mean, I think I agree with, I think Lisa said, Mrs. Roman. It's important that our community gets to use the facilities. I mean, they help pay for it, essentially. And I'm all for that. I think we just need to be careful that it's not overused to the point where, I mean, the upkeep is something that we really have to consider, especially with the all-turf fields. So we just want to make sure, I mean, I joke with Mr. Murray, but, I mean, I'm down there almost every day. I call it like my baby. I take care of it as much as I can to the best of my abilities, because I'm super proud of what we have and what our kids get to use and what our community gets to see every day. So I just think we need to be selected somewhat so that it's not overused, so that we can maintain the status of it.
Thank you very much for the direction, Governing Board, and we'll be back as we've discussed with some additional topics for you.
Sounds good. That brings us to announcements. The next regular scheduled board meeting session will be November 16th, 2021 at 6 p.m. right here in the boardroom. That brings us to adjournment.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Ed Ferrand,
Yes.
Lisa Roman,
Yes.
Kyle Niederman,
Yes.
Martina Aliyar,
Yes.
John Aston,
Yes, we're adjourned.